Welcome to the lands of science fiction stories. I wish you a pleasant listening experience.
The moment Captain Orion Kale entered the Alien War Academy, silence fell like a hammer. Eyes of all colors and shapes fixated on him, some wary, others intrigued. The lecture hall was vast, tiered, and filled with representatives from a dozen different species, each more exotic than the last. They'd gathered here for one reason: to learn from the man who had single-handedly turned the tide of the Battle of Zenthros Prime, a planet that was thought impenetrable by any force. Kale strode toward the center podium, his expression unreadable, save for the small smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth. His appearance was unremarkable by human standards: rugged features, sharp eyes, and a well-maintained uniform marked with Earth's insignia, a symbol that now sent ripples of unease through the galaxy. "Look, it's not my fault they didn't realize we could walk through their shields," Kale said casually, leaning back against the podium as though recounting a simple training exercise. The air grew thick with disbelief. Most of the alien students were silent, but a few exchanged uneasy glances. A towering four-armed alien from the Tharxis species, a race known for their tactical acumen, finally broke the silence. "You walked through their shields?" His deep, gravelly voice was laced with skepticism. "Yeah," Kale shrugged. "Most species design their shields to block energy weapons, but they're tuned to specific frequencies. Once you know what to look for, it's just a matter of finding the gap. Our boots were insulated against the field's current, so we just walked right through." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and the instructors, some of the most elite military minds in the galaxy, exchanged astonished looks. Kale glanced around, his amusement growing. He could already tell what they were thinking: these humans are reckless, unpredictable, and insane. He relished that thought. "Let me walk you through it," Kale said, his tone shifting into a calm, almost casual cadence as if the entire scenario was merely a footnote. "We were up against the Draxer. Nasty bastards. Their forward base was on Varlon 7, a fortress planet, fully loaded with kinetic turrets, orbital bombardment platforms, you name it, they had it. A full frontal assault would have been a suicide mission." "So you used overwhelming numbers?" asked a reptilian-looking student with black scales and sharp claws, his voice thin but cautious. Kale chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Nope. We were outnumbered 5-1. So we improvised." The word hung in the air, causing visible discomfort among the alien students. Improvisation was not something they were accustomed to, certainly not in the methodical, regimented warfare of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. One of the instructors, a Zerethian, with skin resembling polished obsidian and 4 gleaming eyes, narrowed them at Kale. "How does one improvise against a superior force?" the Zerethian asked, his voice smooth but dripping with disdain. Kale smiled wider, enjoying the tension. "First, we send in a decoy fleet, old ships rigged with heat signatures to look real. The Draxer bit hard, diverting their orbital cannons to deal with the fake threat. That gave us a 20-minute window to land a ground team. A student from the Varians, a race known for their tactical prowess, leaned forward. So you landed undetected?" "Not exactly," Kale replied, his tone casual as if he were discussing the weather. "We couldn't rely on stealth tech, it's too easy to pick up. Instead, we triggered a massive sandstorm. Kicked up the atmosphere with a few well-placed charges. The storm blinded their sensors and kept their thermals useless. We dropped in, boots on the ground, right under their noses." The murmuring grew louder. Several students were openly taking notes now, while others struggled to grasp the audacity of what Kale was describing. The Zerethian instructor narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "And once you were inside?" asked another alien from the back of the room, his voice soft but inquisitive. Kale leaned forward slightly, letting the moment build. "We didn't go in guns blazing. The Draxer are efficient, meticulous. Their whole strategy revolves around precise coordination. So we hacked their internal network and introduced small delays, just a few milliseconds here and there. To them, it looked like a minor system glitch, but in reality, their entire chain of command was out of sync. By the time they realized what was happening, we were halfway through their base. A stunned silence settled over the room. Several alien students visibly recoiled, unable to believe that the humans had pulled off such a brazen and unorthodox strategy. "That's why we win," Kale said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because we don't play by your rules. We adapt. We improvise." Suddenly, one of the Cathian instructors stood up, his forearms folding across his massive chest. "But surely," he rumbled, his voice filled with skepticism, "you were detected before reaching critical systems. Their tech is far more advanced than." "We piggybacked off their own network," Kale interrupted smoothly. "Used their communications to create interference. By the time they figured out what was happening, their own system was turning against them." The Cathian's stone-like face contorted with disbelief. "That would be dishonorable by most galactic standards." Kale shrugged. "Honorable or not, it worked. We walked out with minimal losses. That's all that matters." The tension in the room reached a boiling point, but Kale wasn't done. "The thing about humans," he continued, locking eyes with the aliens around him, "is that we don't stick to the script. We do whatever it takes to survive. We don't fight clean. We fight to win." Another murmur spread through the crowd, but this time it was more subdued, as though they were beginning to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. Kale's gaze swept the room one final time, his voice steady and unflinching. "We aren't the strongest. We aren't the most advanced. But we're the most unpredictable. And that's what makes us dangerous." The room fell silent again, the weight of Kale's words sinking in. The alien students, who had once thought humans primitive and unsophisticated, now saw the cold, calculated brilliance of their methods. The unsettling realization that these Deathworlders were far more than they seemed lingered in the air like an unspoken threat. Kale stood up, straightened his uniform, and with one last smirk, left the hall, leaving behind a group of alien students and instructors who would never look at humanity the same way again. Captain Orion Kale returned to his quarters, still amused by the alien students' reactions. Their expressions of disbelief, the sheer shock at humanity's tactics, it never got old. He poured himself a drink, a simple amber liquid that calmed his nerves after every mission. As the alcohol burned its way down, a soft chime alerted him to an incoming message. "Captain Kale," the voice of Admiral Taran came through, sharp and authoritative. "We need to debrief. Meet me in Command Center 5. Kale sighed, setting the glass down. He knew what this was about. The higher-ups were still uneasy about how he handled the Draxer mission. They always were, but results were hard to argue with. He made his way to the command center, the metallic halls of the human sector buzzing with activity as soldiers and engineers moved with purpose. When Kale entered the room, Admiral Taran was waiting, her face as stern as ever. "Take a seat, Captain." Kale complied, lounging in the chair with the same casual demeanor that had unnerved so many in the lecture hall. Taran, a veteran of countless campaigns, narrowed her eyes at his relaxed posture. "The Council is asking questions," she began, her voice laced with frustration. "They don't like how you're operating." Kale raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that my job? To win wars?" "It is," Taran replied, pacing behind her desk, "but your methods are unconventional. There are concerns, especially from our allies. They're not used to our way of doing things." Kale let out a small chuckle, his smirk returning. "Yeah, I noticed that during my lecture." Taran shot him a glare that could freeze a star. "This isn't a joke, Orion. The Draxer may have been a success, but the Council believes we're becoming too unpredictable, too chaotic. We're fighting wars, not performing ballet. Chaos is part of the game." "You've drawn the attention of the Zyra Collective," Taran said, her tone grave. "They're watching us closely now. Their leadership isn't happy about how we handled the situation on Varlon 7. Kale's smirk faded slightly at the mention of the Zyra. The Collective was a powerful force, one of the few factions in the galaxy with technology on par with the United Galactic Alliance. They prided themselves on precision and order, their entire society built on control and discipline. In their eyes, humanity's unpredictability was a dangerous variable. What do they want? Kale asked, his voice more serious now. Taran sat down across from him, leaning forward. They've requested a diplomatic envoy. They want to understand how we think. How we operate. Kale snorted. Good luck with that. They've specifically requested you, Captain. That caught him off guard. The Zyra Collective was known for their distrust of outsiders, especially humans. For them to ask for a meeting with him meant something bigger was in play. Why me? You've become something of a fascination for them, Taran said, choosing her words carefully. Your tactics, your ability to adapt, it's shaking their confidence. They're used to controlling every aspect of a conflict, but you've shown them that humans don't play by their rules. Kale leaned back, his mind racing. The Zyra were dangerous, not because of their numbers or brute strength, but because of their ability to predict and neutralize threats before they even arose. For them to be interested in him meant they saw humanity as more than just a primitive race. They saw them as a potential threat. And what do they expect me to say? Kale asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. That we'll stop being so unpredictable? That we'll start fighting by their playbook? Taran's expression softened, a rare occurrence for the hard-edged admiral. They won't say it outright, but they're afraid of us. They don't understand how we can win without overwhelming force, without perfect precision. Because we're human, Admiral, Kale replied, his tone more serious than before. We don't fight clean. We fight to survive. Taran regarded him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Finally, she sighed. Just, be careful, Kale. The Zyra are playing a different game. They don't like variables they can't control. Kale stood, nodding. I'll keep that in mind. As he made his way out of the command center, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. The Zyra weren't just interested in understanding human tactics, they were trying to predict the next move. And that made them more dangerous than any brute force enemy he'd faced before. The diplomatic ship arrived at the edge of Zyra space a few days later, sleek and imposing. Kale stood on the bridge of the Raven, watching as the Zyra vessel approached. Its design was flawless, every line and curve calculated for maximum efficiency. It was a stark contrast to the rugged, battle-worn ships of the UGA. They've hailed us, said Lieutenant Joran, his voice tense. Opening communication now. The holographic screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a Zyra envoy. She was striking, with sharp features and silver-blue skin, her eyes glowing with a cold, analytical intensity. She wore the crisp, white uniform of the Zyra Collective, every detail immaculate. Captain Kale, she said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. I am Envoy Sales. Welcome to Zyra space. Kale nodded, maintaining his calm demeanor. Envoy. What can I do for you? Sales studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. The Collective has requested a debrief on your recent campaign. We are interested in understanding your methods. Kale's smirk returned. I'm sure you are. Your tactics on Varlon 7 were unconventional, Sales continued, her voice carefully measured. You circumvented our allies' defenses in ways we did not anticipate. The Collective finds this concerning. Kale leaned forward slightly, his tone casual. Concerned that we're not playing by the same rules? Sales' eyes flashed with something, annoyance, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Concerned that your species may pose a threat to the established order of conflict. Your unpredictability undermines the structure we have spent centuries cultivating. Funny thing about unpredictability, Kale said, his voice lowering. It's not something you can plan for. You either adapt or you get left behind. Sales' expression remained neutral, but Kale could sense the tension beneath the surface. The Zyra were perfectionists, their entire way of life built on control and precision. The idea that a race like humanity could outmaneuver them was deeply unsettling. We have adapted to many challenges over the centuries, Captain, Sales replied. But you, humans, are different. You fight as though you have nothing to lose. Kale shrugged, his gaze locked on hers. Maybe because we don't. Not when survival's on the line. The tension between them crackled like static. Sayles, for all her cold professionalism, couldn't hide the fact that humans had thrown the Zyra collective off balance. They weren't used to enemies who thrived on chaos. "Let's get this debrief started," Kale said with a grin. "I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve that might surprise you." The debrief began in the sleek, minimalist chamber aboard the Zyra vessel. Kale stood in the center, surrounded by holographic projections of the battlefield on Varlon 7. Sayles watched intently, her cold gaze never wavering as Kale described, in painstaking detail, the tactics that had bewildered the galaxy. "Your forces bypassed the Draxxer's kinetic turrets entirely," Sayles said, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "Yet you had no superiority in numbers or technology. You exploited weaknesses in ways even we had not foreseen." "That's the thing about us humans," Kale said, smirking slightly. "We find the cracks. The gaps. No matter how perfect you think your defenses are, there's always something you missed." Sayles studied him for a moment longer, then gestured to one of her aides. A new hologram appeared, showing a series of heavily fortified planets, Zyra strongholds, each with defenses that made Varlon 7 look like child's play. It was clear what she was implying. "You believe you can find the gaps in our defenses, Captain?" Sayles asked, her tone growing colder. "The Zyra collective is not like the Draxxer. We do not leave things to chance." Kale crossed his arms, unbothered by the mounting tension. "Every system has a flaw, Sayles. Yours is no different." The room fell into an icy silence, the other Zyra officers watching the exchange with growing unease. They didn't like where this was going. Sayles, however, remained unfazed, her calculating eyes focused entirely on Kale. "You have proven that your people can disrupt even the most fortified positions," she said quietly. "But what happens when you encounter an enemy who adapts just as quickly? Who anticipates your every move?" Kale's smirk didn't waver. "That's the thing about adaptation, you can't predict it. You can plan for every contingency, but we're always going to do something you didn't see coming." Sayles took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And what if we decide that humanity is too dangerous to let roam unchecked? What if the Zyra collective takes action to neutralize your threat?" Kale's expression shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. He'd been expecting something like this. The Zyra weren't just interested in understanding humanity, they were looking for a way to control them. To eliminate the unpredictable variable before it could destabilize their carefully maintained order. "And what makes you think you could?" Kale asked, his tone dropping to a dangerous calm. Sayles didn't flinch. "We have technology far beyond your understanding. Weapons that could decimate entire systems in the blink of an eye. You may have won a few skirmishes, Captain, but the collective is not the Draxxer. We would not be so easily outmaneuvered." Kale chuckled softly, his smirk returning. "Funny thing about power, Sayles. It makes you think you're invincible. But the bigger they are, the harder they fall," Sayles finished, her gaze hardening. "I know the saying." The tension in the room was palpable now, the air thick with the unspoken threat hanging between them. Kale knew the Zyra collective could be a formidable enemy if they chose to be, but they still didn't understand. They were still trying to fight by the rules. "I'll tell you something," Kale said, his voice growing serious. "You might have better tech, bigger ships, stronger soldiers. But none of that matters if you can't adapt. And you can't adapt if you're too busy trying to control everything." Sayles regarded him silently for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she straightened, her icy demeanor returning. "This debrief is over," she said coolly. "Return to your ship, Captain. The collective will be in touch with your superiors soon." Kale gave a mock salute, his grin unwavering. Looking forward to it. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The Zyra wouldn't back down so easily, and humanity's unpredictable nature would only continue to unsettle the galaxy's more rigid civilizations. But that was the point, wasn't it? To keep them on their toes. to make them realize that humanity wasn't going to play by their rules. Back aboard the Raven, Kale stood on the bridge, watching as the Zyra ship drifted out of view. He could feel the weight of what had just transpired, the knowledge that humanity had caught the attention of one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. But instead of fear, Kale felt something else, pride. Humanity had always been underestimated, dismissed as primitive or reckless. But now they were showing the galaxy what they were truly capable of. "They're afraid of us," Lieutenant Joran said, standing next to him. Kale nodded, his smirk returning. "Good. Let them be." As the Raven prepared to leave Zyra space, Kale couldn't help but think about the future. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it. They were no longer the underdogs, no longer the unpredictable anomaly in a universe of rigid systems. They were the ones changing the rules. And they weren't about to stop. Epilogue: The Silent Watchers. In the depths of Zyra space, far from the prying eyes of the United Galactic Alliance, a council of Zyra leaders convened in secret. The holographic image of Celes stood in the center of the chamber, her expression calm but her voice filled with warning. "Captain Kale's tactics are dangerous," she said. "He represents everything we feared about the humans. They cannot be controlled, and their adaptability poses a threat to the stability of the galaxy." One of the council members, a tall, regal figure with silver skin and glowing eyes, leaned forward. "And what do you propose we do?" Celes hesitated for a moment, then her gaze hardened. "We must neutralize them. Before they become too powerful to stop." The council murmured in agreement, their faces grim. Humanity's rise had not gone unnoticed, and the collective was not prepared to let it continue unchecked. But even as they made their plans, a quiet realization settled over them. The humans had already outmaneuvered them once. And it wouldn't be the last time. The end.